Good question. It won't. No, it's not going to be a DVD release. The rights weren't cleared for DVD release. So you'll have to get it surreptitiously and transmit it along the Underground Railroad. It'll come off the internet somewhere like it always does. The project came about, Richard and I have worked together numerous times over the years, and we decided we wanted to work together, and we started a production company called Prodigious Media. And we were trying to cook up our first idea, and we were thinking about some of our interests. We both worked on a series called The Drug Years, and that dealt only like very, very briefly with the crack epidemic. And we thought it was an interesting area to explore. And we saw when Jay-Z was on the 2009 World Series, and he was the entertainment, and he came out and sang his song Empire States of Mind. And in the song there are all these lyrics about referring to stash houses and copying from his Dominicanas, and it kind of amazed us that, you know, on that level of like the American stage, that here was this guy who had become this superstar in hip-hop, who had, you know, was now this like hugely successful mainstream entertainer, and he was basically rapping about dealing crack. And it was just really interesting to us, and we were wondering if, like, people, you know, normal people even knew what he was talking about. And that became, in a way, the paradigm of the film. We thought, wouldn't it be interesting to tell that story in a way, tell the story of that generation.
This is going to be on TV tomorrow.
It's going to be on
It's going to be TV at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Talk to those executives at VH1.
No, we had the same problem. We did a series about hip-hop in 2004 called And You Don't Stop. It's a 5-hour series, and that never got released on DVD either, just because, you know, the music was considered too, by whoever the VH1 distribution.
Is that mic on?
Is that bad?
I think we could make it as a theatrical release.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is there any kind of talk for that?
No. I mean, you know, honestly, we would have liked to see it in a few more festivals and like take longer before it came on the air. But this is the only festival screening it's going to get, because I think once it's been on the air, you know, festivals aren't so interested. Maybe internationally.
Yeah.
But it's a VH1 decision basically.
It's a shame.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a damn shame.
A damn shame.
In the Daily News today?
You read it?
Yeah. Yeah, I saw it. I thought it was a pretty good review. It's a difficult subject, you know. I mean, it's deep and it's complex narratively and politically and socially and morally and racially and on and on and on. It was a big challenge to do this piece. And, you know, we sort of gave it a hip-hop frame, but we were interested in exploring many different aspects of it.
I think that's a yes, that you were impressed with it.
With the film or with the review? Yeah, I thought the review was pretty good. I mean, you know, basically what they said was, the gist of the review was they complimented the production because it didn't glorify crack. You know, I don't see how anyone could glorify crack. You know, crack was a nightmare, you know, on one level. And on another level, it was many, many things. So that's kind of like, you know, the film was, like all films, is just like the tip of the iceberg. So what the media is going to write about is even going to be like even the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. And if you look at how the media covered crack back in the day, you see how crazy it all was. So it's really hard to get some sanity and some perspective on this subject, which is pretty much what we try to do.
We did. I mean, RZA was the first person we interviewed, and he responded to the subject, and you know, immediately I had the sense that this was something that no one had really asked him about, or at least it's not something he talked about recently, and you know, he just talked solidly for the whole tape, basically for half an hour, and it seemed like it was something that was, you know, they just had a lot to say about. There were people that refused to do it. 50 Cent, for example, he said he didn't want to talk about crack. Nas didn't refuse to do it. Jay-Z was too busy. But you know, I mean, I feel like we got a good. We were able to put together a good cast, and you know, having more people wouldn't have necessarily made it better. You know, I think having a small number of people that you can focus on and sort of, you know, go in some depth is preferable to, you know, sort of talking to everybody. And everybody would be a lot of people. We've basically been working full-time at VH1 for just over a year, and we developed it for probably a year before that.
We have no idea, really. I mean, I'm waiting to hear from Dan Lundgren. I mean, he could go ballistic when he sees this. You know, he was involved, he supported the Fair Sentencing Act, but this was the guy, when he was Attorney General of California, who instituted the 3 strikes and you're out policy, which is, like, very controversial. And, you know, he agreed to be in the thing, and he didn't really know that it was going to have such a hip-hop angle. And really, I mean, I have no idea how he's going to react to it, and I wouldn't be the slightest surprise if I get a really, really irate email from him sometime very soon. But, you know, in terms of how the rest of the media is going to react to it, I have no idea. About the subject? Yeah. Oh, wow, yeah. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, I mean, I think that there was the lesson in one way. We originally intended the film to be even taken more and to really take a look at the whole of this thing called the crack epidemic and try and look at all sorts of different aspects of that. I mean, one whole episode that we shot a lot of material for was the story of cocaine toxic babies, crack babies, and how that subject was treated in the media and how that was treated in legal circles and so on, and it never saw the light of day because, you know, this is an 84-minute film. It was originally only intended to be a 66-minute film. We managed to convince VH1 that it was worthy of being 84 minutes. There's only so much you can do, and you know, shooting more and trying to make your film cover more ground doesn't necessarily make it better. I mean, it's kind of like saying the same as with the number of characters you have. I think personally, I think it's better to go, you know, go into depth with a small subject, a narrow subject, smaller number of characters, rather than try to do everything, you know, in one film. That was one of my takeaways.
I found it a humbling experience making this film, personally. I feel really good about the end result. The journey was, you know, twisting and turning and long and lots of potholes in the road. The good news is that I think Richard and I kind of like bucked up and really found a way to tell the story, and you know, enjoyed working with each other and worked very well together. And like anything, you know, there's a part of it that you always sort of, you know, when you make a film, you can never really forget about the things that, you know, got left on the cutting room floor, you know, that were absolutely, you know, gem-like. And And I think every project is like that, and there was certainly a lot in this one about that too. There were characters that we could never weave in that were just unforgettable, and moments and aspects of the politics of it. But I think in terms of like what it turned out to be and the venue that we produced it for, I'm very happy with the end result.
Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Sure.
I have mixed feelings about the film. I feel that, well, number one, I appreciate your interest in your giving light to this very important issue. It's been a social issue, it's been an economic issue. I do feel that there have been pervasive myths and stereotypes about who Black American men are, and the demonization of Black men is something that's been going on since 1619, when our ancestors first arrived here. And the images that were shown in this film and in other films that discuss hip-hop culture and the social deviancy that seems to be inherent within it, I have a real problem with the fact that there is no discussion about the redemption, and that there's more to Black culture and hip-hop culture than sports, drugs, and entertainment. We had many Blacks in the hip-hop culture, as myself, who were solidly middle class, who were educated, Run DMC, their parents were college professors. Russell Simmons went to college. You know, you had Graham was Theodore's parents worked. You know, there were working Blacks who were also part of the culture. It wasn't all that everyone was invested in crime or was a part of crime. And even today, I'm a college professor, and my colleagues have no value. They see no value in my culture as hip-hop. They look at me as I'm the Black girl in the English department who does that hip-hop rap stuff. And for them, it's not valuable in the same way that their conversations about Hemingway are valuable, because they still see it as this deviant language and narrative. And I think that when we discuss hip-hop, yes, drugs were a part of it, but that wasn't a sole factor. And there was much more, and there's much more to the culture and to the people and the legacy that drove us and that we have pushed forward in this American narrative. And it would be nice if I could watch a documentary about hip-hop that gave more, I think, of a soul to the people that were part of it. Mm-hmm. This is like what this film was to me was more like a Polaroid snapshot of a much larger discourse. And so while you say you can't do everything, I understand that. But I just know that there's a lot more that could have been discussed, like the prison industrial complex. And what the real agenda was, and still is for people deeply invested in demonizing the culture for the sake of their own political agendas. And so that's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Would you like to respond to her?
Sure. No, I think you got a valid point, and I think that that was something that we were kind of struggling with throughout, is that the film tries to strike some kind of a balance. I mean, we would never try to tell the whole story of hip-hop in this film. I mean, it's only a fragment, and try to follow the story of this small number of characters, our 4 central characters. And even them, I mean, we don't really tell their whole story. It was approached through looking at it through the lens of the drug and what this drug meant to them within the context of the music. I mean, we absolutely tried to foreground some of what you're talking about in terms of the media representation of Black men in the crack epidemic, and certainly we tried to show the way that hip hop, specifically with Public Enemy, spoke out against the crack epidemic, and that it wasn't that hip-hop responded in all sorts of ways to the drug. But I mean, we absolutely tried to steer a course between showing the different aspects of how, on the one hand, there were. I mean, I think that in the 90s, the people that sort of really lived through this, there was never any real glamorizing of the culture. You know, I think that when we get to sort of more recent times, we show the Rick Ross record, and those records sound different to me than the records that were made in the 90s. You know, by Wu-Tang Clan, for example. But no, I mean, you know, I think your concerns are absolutely valid, and it was a struggle to deal with. We absolutely wanted to deal with the prison-industrial complex and other issues of social justice, but at the same time, you know, there's it's always difficult to integrate that with dealing with hip hop culture, dealing with the material that can allow you to get this subject onto the air on a channel like VH1, you know. And I hope that we were, you know, doing that and we were able to reach a wider audience. We'll see what happens when it's broadcast over the next week. To get people talking about some of these issues, you know, and reach a young audience. I mean, the average viewer for VH1 is 24 years old, I think. So, you know, I sort of have some mixed feelings about it myself. I wish we'd been able to skew the balance a little bit more. We'd be able to talk about the prison industrial complex at great length too. You have something to say?
Well, we did deal with mass incarceration, and what I assume that you mean by the prison industrial complex is the fact that prisons, you know, during the Bush era were privatized and taken public as corporations, so that there's actual profit now in incarceration. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, I wish we could have done that too. And I wish we could have talked about crack babies. That's another film. Richard and I may actually make another film at some point about that. And like Richard, I also recognize your critique as valid. I mean, it's kind of like, is that all there is to, you know, if this is going to be shown as a representation of hip-hop, there's so much more to it, obviously. This is only a part of it. In a way, it's the underside of it. I mean, our protagonists, our main characters, were criminals. I mean, why didn't we deal with the conscious rappers, for example? You know, they're not a part of this story. We're not really making a story that's necessarily about hip-hop. We're talking about the crack epidemic and how it shaped hip-hop at only a certain phase in its development. So that's kind of the trade-off right there. And, you know, and when we had the screening at the Paley Center the other night, a number of people like came up to me, and that was the first thing that they had to say. It was like, it's really a shame that you couldn't have had that rapper in there or that rapper. And actually, Charles Roberson, who is our consulting producer, you know, he told us all along that there were people who were going to be offended by the fact that, you know, that they would see this as somehow a misrepresentation of hip hop. So, you know, we take your point.
I think that was really part of the whole concept of the film, was to I think we're always looking to, or I'm always looking to find subjects where the personal stories kind of intersect with politics and popular culture, and this seemed to be, you know, the sort of intersection of all those things. So, I mean, in a way, that was always part of the idea.
So we'll take one more question or comment.
I have a comment. It's really good to see the story of hip hop unfolding in a documentary like such. But I also agree with the woman that said earlier about us creating a snapshot of what we look like. When people who don't even know anything about hip hop or our culture, they look at this and they don't see the distinction between the hip hop culture and the crack epidemic. And I just wish that, you know, for my parents' sake and for, you know, for other people in our community, that it was a little bit more exposed, that there were people fighting this. You know, there were people in our communities who were doing different things to prevent this from happening. You know, there were a lot of mothers who shed tears, and there were a lot of fighters and a lot of poets who spoke up against this, and that has yet to be showcased on film or on screen. So that's the only disappointing thing from watching this. It's kind of like, you know, when you're yearning to that, you know, it hasn't been explained yet. But everything was concrete, and it was a very, very structured piece. So.
No, I mean, I take your point, and certainly there's a lot more sort of anti-crack songs, anti-crack, you know, hip-hop records that could have been in there. There's so many sort of records on the subject that it's kind of overwhelming. And, you know, I mean, as I said before, for us, the sort of the Public Enemy record stood for that. I mean, there's KRS-One records, there's the Close the Crack House, Professor X's record. I mean, those were in different cuts actually, and you know, in the end, it was the Public Enemy one that ended up sort of standing for that. But you know, it's certainly true. There could have been many more. You know, you could have there's hours and hours of music on this subject.
The thing that was really significant to me was seeing how hip-hop in many different ways documented and reflected the crack epidemic in ways that were more truthful and more authentic than the mainstream media. And that's one of the things that we tried to show. There was no music that we were aware of that ever said that crack was a good thing. You know, it was about the subject. You know, you could make the case that, you know, some of the music at times romanticizes the life of the hustler. You know, in the era of Rick Ross, and you know, if you sort of look at it that way, that's the only part of it that to me is, you know, in some way inauthentic. But the rest of it, whether it was, you know, if it wasn't, you know, anti-crack, then it was like, here's what's happening, here's what was really going on with crack. You know, here's the effect that it had on people. Here's the effect that it had on communities. Here's the effect that it had on the street life. Here's the effect that it had on law enforcement. And all of that's in the music in a very, very vivid and powerful way. And I think that comes across in the film.